Are you perhaps a bit familiar with the World Economic Forum? We are on the other side of the lake here in Geneva. We are a foundation that was started about 42 years ago. We're probably best known for our annual event in Davos, but what I'm here to talk to you about is one of our initiatives. We have more than 100 initiatives going on within the forum around many pressing global issues, and one of them happens to be anti-corruption and transparency. And about, I would say, 2 months ago, we had the opportunity to connect with the UNECE in the context of an infrastructure collective action project, which I'll talk about in just a minute, around transparency and anti-corruption. So what can the community of global business leaders do to bring a much greater transparency to the process of major strategic infrastructure investment? And this proved to be a very interesting point for cooperation with the UNECE. So we've learned a little bit about your work in public-private partnerships and now your focus on transparency. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about what we do with members of the business community to embody, I think, many of the same objectives that you're trying to drive forward with through your work at ECE. So just a bit of background on the Partnering Against Corruption initiative. We started about 10 years ago working with CEOs from all over the world around a set of principles, core business principles. And in fact, we worked very closely with Transparency International and others to create a set of principles that CEOs would sign on to, starting with a zero-tolerance policy around corruption in all its forms. And back in the day, so about 10 years ago, it was a different environment than it is now, and that companies were just waking up to a lot of the pending enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the U.S. and subsequently the UK Bribery Act. There was quite a focus on what companies could do to reach a better state of compliance internally. So dealing with the business risks associated with their third-party vendors, their supply chains, procurement processes, and working with governments, and the like. And so this community was created by a group of CEOs from the engineering and construction fields, metals and mining, and oil and gas. So 3 sectors that are quite well known for their challenges in terms of corruption and lack of transparency. And over the years, we've worked with more than 250 companies at any given time, global companies, who really want to improve their compliance effort. But over the last, I'd say, 2 or 3 years, the focus of what we're doing within our anti-corruption work has changed. And this is really a reflection of the market dynamics and probably some of the same drivers that influence the work that you're doing. When we talk about those core drivers affecting business interest in issues of corruption and transparency, these are macro-level drivers. It's the societal engagement in promoting anti-corruption at a level that we've never seen before, thanks in part to social media and to the work of organizations like TI. It's a growing understanding on the part of governments that competitiveness and corruption are correlated, and in order to achieve a very high level of competitiveness, you need to have a transparent process in terms of how you make investments as a country. And then, of course, from the business side, the truth is that CEOs and board chairs are no longer in a position to have plausible deniability about what goes on within their organization. So what does that mean? It means they're responsible for everything that happens throughout their supply chains, whether it's a U.S. company operating in India or, let's say, an Austrian company operating in Africa. It doesn't really matter these days. If you're a global player, chances are you fall under a legal framework that requires you to have a pretty high degree of transparency around what you do. And if you don't, there's the potential that you will be prosecuted for doing the wrong thing. So there's a reputational risk associated with that. There's also a broader risk, I think, over time, because more and more we hear from companies with whom we work that if you're known to be corrupt in terms of your approach, you may get the jobs, but you're not going to get the best jobs. And this is a shift, and this is great news, actually. It's good news for you, and it's good news for us in our work around these issues. Now, it's not universally the case that this is true, but more and more, I think, at least the global companies are waking up to the fact that they need to operate by the highest set of standards. So how do we help them do that? And that's really the question. So in addition to the work that we do around helping with internal compliance, we also have a forum of CEOs who come together every year at our annual meeting in Davos. They're called the Vanguard of PPP. And we started this last year with 25 CEOs, some of whom came from the engineering and infrastructure and construction field. And the idea was to create a more strategic global agenda around our work. We started this collaboration closely working with the OECD around promoting the adoption of the OECD Convention Against Bribery, which is a key legal instrument that we think needs to be further adopted, particularly in emerging markets, frontier markets, where there could be a lack of a legal framework, and these sorts of instruments can play a huge role. We're also very engaged in public awareness and connecting into youth engagement. And while this connection may not seem as important, it's actually quite critical, because a lot of the shift in terms of this, I guess I would call it how would I say it? The societal, it's Monday, I can't think of the word, sort of intolerance, there we go, of the status quo is really driven by the millennials. So that age group between 18 and 30 who are increasingly taking to the streets, to the internet, to many other fora, and demanding a higher degree of transparency and expectations from business and government. And this actually does impact the work that we do. For businesses, it's about the next generation of workforce that comes into their organization. It may be the next generation of public servants. It's certainly the folks who will be voting over the next 30 to 40 years. So this idea of getting to the millennials and bringing them into the conversation about transparency is also quite important. And we've also spent some time on this question of if we were to engage more deeply with governments, with certain segments of the population, the public, what question would we ask to try to frame this discussion? And the question we came up with was quite simple, which is, how do we design corruption out of the system? And the system applies in different ways, depending on what system you're talking about. In this case, we might be talking about the system of public procurement. In other cases, we might be talking about the system of governance as it relates to the engagement of a youth population. So we've asked the same question, but we've asked it of different stakeholders. And through this process, we came up with a map, what we call a transformation map. And we identified 18 core drivers that we think are the most important to address this question of designing corruption out of the system. And one, of course, is focused on the very real systemic issue of procurement, in particular public procurement, and how we get to a much greater degree of transparency. Now, there's a lot of work being done in this space by the World Bank. TI has done some work, OECD. And we've come to believe that there needs to be a common standard around a best practice for public procurement, one that would embody much more use of technology, and one that would be fully embraced by a global business community. So that's an area of particular importance. Another area that's come up as key in terms of answering this question, how do we design corruption out of the system, is around the notion of collective action. And this is quite important. So when we bring a group of companies together, we're not just looking to talk about what the issues are. We actually want to catalyze some movement, some activity. And collective action is the way to do that, particularly for problems that can't be resolved by one organization. So in the case of infrastructure, we just launched a collective action project where we're conducting a risk assessment across the real estate sector, across the engineering and construction sector, to try to get a view on those sector-specific risks that really drive the concerns from business. Once that risk assessment is done, we can heat map that assessment across regions and use it as a frame for developing a collective action agenda. So we did this last year with members of the aviation and travel community. And it was quite interesting to see that one of the key challenges from the aviation and travel community, so we're talking about companies like Marriott and Starwood and Hilton and others who are kind of in the travel and tourism business, is around licensing and permitting fees. And actually, that's one of the same risks coming up in the infrastructure review. So we're finding that as we do these risk assessments, many of the risks are common challenges, and there's an opportunity to bring many sectors together to address these common issues. Because if everyone's getting stuck at the real estate and permitting level, then how important would that be then to bring together 100 companies versus 10 in a particular market, let's say? around these challenges. So this is the sort of work that we're moving towards in our next phase, our second decade of our work in Patchy, and could be quite relevant and we hope interesting to connect further as you develop your work through this important engagement. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you, and I wish you good luck with your work. Thank you.